Listen here, children of the red dust. Come closer to the low fire, draw yourselves near. 'Cause this memory don't like being told from afar. She comes heavy. She comes hot. She comes smelling like burnt flesh and glowing wood. I speak as one who crossed the middle passage without name and without ground. I speak as one who's seen the ocean swallow cries and give back silence. I speak as one who buried children with these very hands and still learned to remember. Today I tell the story of Harper of the Fire Club. Now listen, good folk. This ain't no tale for the faint-hearted. This ain't no story to pass the time while the cornbread bakes. This here is blood memory, carved into the very bones of this land we walk. Every word I speak carries the weight of them iron chains. Every pause holds the echo of them auction blocks. Every breath remembers the salt taste of tears mixed with Atlantic water. In them days of deep sorrow, when the sun rose only to count suffering and set only to mark another day survived, there lived a man who wasn't yet Harper. Wasn't yet nothing but a number in a master's ledger, a strong back for cotton fields, a soul marked for breaking. But the Lord have mercy, some souls don't break easy. Some souls gather fire instead of giving up their flame. The old ones warned us, child. They warned us true. They said, when a man's heart gets too full of pain, it either cracks open like dry earth or it hardens like iron in the forge. Harper's heart chose iron, chose fire, chose something the white folks never seen coming. I tell you now, this story carries heavy spirits. The ancestors who walked before us, they still whispering in the wind that moves through them cotton fields. They still crying in the sound of rushing water. They still praying in the silence between the mockingbird songs. And Harper, Lord help us. Harper's still walking too, still carrying that burning wood. Still teaching us what it means to say no when the whole world telling you to bow down. Folks swear on their lives they seen him. Down in the deep woods where the cypress trees grow thick and the Spanish moss hangs like the ghosts of hanged men. They seen a tall figure moving through the mist, carrying something that glows red in the darkness. Some say it's just swamp gas. Others say it's the memory of fire that never dies, the flame that burns eternal in the hearts of them who refuse to be broken. But I'm getting ahead of myself, child. The beginning of Harper's story ain't where the fire starts. The beginning is in the forgetting. The beginning is in the taking away of everything that makes a person whole, until all that's left is the raw spirit, burning underneath like coals covered in ash. You see, in them slave quarters, where the walls were thin and the hope thinner, we learned to speak in whispers. We learned to hide our true names deep inside, where the overseer's whip couldn't reach. We learned that to survive, sometimes you got to let them think they killed everything in you that matters. But suffering, Lord knows, suffering can teach lessons too. Can teach a man that pain has limits, but will don't. The night falls like a curse over these old memories, child. But in that darkness, something was always growing. In them hush harbors where we gathered to pray and remember our ancestors' ways, we learned that the same God who parted the Red Sea was watching over us. We learned that the spirits of our African fathers and mothers were still speaking through the wind and the water and the fire. And fire, child, fire was always sacred to our people. Fire to cook the food that kept us alive. Fire to light the darkness when the day's work was done. Fire to burn away sickness. Fire to carry prayers up to heaven. But for Harper, fire was going to be something else. Something that would make the earth tremble, and the masters remember that every soul they tried to crush carried the spark of the divine. That's how this memory begins, with fire waiting to be born. With a man who didn't yet know his true name, standing in the quarters after another day of picking cotton till his fingers bled, looking up at the stars and wondering if freedom was something written in heaven or something you had to forge with your own hands. Now you see, people, before Harper was Harper, before he carried that burning wood, before his name became legend whispered in the quarters and feared in the big house, he was just another number, just another strong-backed man counted like cattle, priced like tobacco, sold like cotton by the pound. They called him boy, they called him buck. They called him whatever suited their needs when the work bell rang before dawn and the overseer's whip cracked like thunder over the fields. But names, child, names are powerful things. And the name they gave him wasn't his name. Wasn't the name his mama whispered in the hold of that slave ship. Wasn't the name carried down from his African fathers? Wasn't nothing but another chain wrapped around his spirit? Lord, have mercy on the souls who tried to steal our identity. But mercy me, they couldn't steal what lived deeper than skin, deeper than flesh, deeper than the brand marks they burned into our bodies to mark us as property. They couldn't steal the memory that lived in the blood, the wisdom that came through the umbilical cord, the prayers that traveled across the Atlantic in the hearts of our ancestors. Sweet Jesus, the erasure was complete. One day you're a child with a family, with a village that knows your laugh and your tears. Next day you're cargo in the belly of a ship that smells like death and sounds like hell. The ocean swallows your screams and gives back silence. The middle passage takes your language and leaves you empty words. The auction block strips away your last hope and sells it to the highest bidder. But listen here, folk. Even in that emptiness, something was growing. In the quarters where they packed us like grain in storage, where the walls leaked rain and the floor stayed damp with tears, where children learned to cry quietly so they wouldn't bring the whip. In that very place, resistance was being born. Harper learned early that watching was surviving. In them days of heavy chains and heavier hearts, a man who could see trouble coming lived longer than one who couldn't. He learned to read the overseer's moods by the way his boots hit the ground. He learned to feel the master's temper by how the dogs walked beside him. He learned that knowledge, even the bitter kind, was the only possession they couldn't take away. The plantation was a mouth that fed on black bodies. Cotton fields stretched like a green sea under the burning sun, and we were the fish caught in nets, gasping for breath while the hooks tore at our flesh. From before sunrise to past sunset, bent backs and bleeding hands picked the white gold that made rich men richer and free men slaves. Old wise ones in the quarters used to say, "The cotton drink our sweat, the tobacco smoke our prayers, but the earth remember everything." They was right, child. The red clay of Virginia still holding our footprints. The tobacco leaves still whispering our songs. The cotton bowls still carrying the salt of our tears. Harper walked them rows like a ghost with substance. 6 feet tall if he was an inch, with hands that could snap a branch or gentle a frightened child. His eyes held that dangerous light, the kind that made the overseer nervous and the master wonder if he'd bought rebellion along with muscle. But Harper kept that fire banked low, like coals covered with ash, glowing underneath, waiting for wind. In the evenings, when the work bells finally fell silent and the quarters filled with the sounds of exhausted bodies finding rest, Harper would sit by the small fire and listen to the old stories. Stories about African kings and queens. Stories about conjure women who could call down rain or stop it with a word. Stories about men who could fly back home across the water when the suffering got too heavy to bear. The elders spoke in whispers about root work and the power that lived in the earth. About the spirits of ancestors who walked among us, invisible to white eyes, but clear as daylight to those who knew how to see. About the day that was coming when the slaves would inherit the earth and the masters would taste the bitter bread of judgment. Every soul got a breaking point, old Aunt Hagar used to say, her voice like gravel and honey mixed together. But some souls, they bend so far toward breaking that they spring back like a willow in storm wind. They don't break, child. They become something stronger. Harper was becoming something stronger. Day by day, lash by lash, humiliation by humiliation. Something was hardening inside him like iron in the furnace. Something that would soon catch fire and burn so bright that the whole plantation would see the light. And that light was going to cost blood. That plantation, child, that plantation wasn't just land for growing cotton. Was a place where they counted everything except what mattered. Counted bales and bushels, counted whip strokes and work hours, counted bodies bought and bodies buried. But they never counted tears, never counted prayers whispered in the dark, never counted the rage building in hearts they thought they'd broken clean through. The master's house sat on the hill like a white tomb, all columns and comfort built on the foundation of our suffering. From them windows, you could see the whole plantation spread out like a map of misery. Cotton fields to the east, tobacco patches to the south, slave quarters tucked back in the hollow, where the big house folks didn't have to look at the proof of their shame. Mr. William Hartwell was the master's name, and he wore righteousness like a Sunday coat, prayed every morning with his family, read scripture at dinner, talked about Christian duty while his overseer split our backs with seasoned hickory, had a way of looking right through black skin like we was just talking shadows that happened to pick cotton. But the overseer, Lord of Glory, the overseer was something different. Mr. Jonas Pike, they called him, and he wore cruelty like a comfortable old hat. Wasn't no pretense with Pike, wasn't no Bible verses or talk about civilizing the African. Just the clean, simple mathematics of fear. Make them afraid enough, work them hard enough, break them down far enough, and you got yourself a profitable cotton crop. Pike walked them fields with his boots always polished and his whip always ready. Tall, lean man with pale eyes that looked at black flesh the way a butcher looks at meat. Had a system for everything. A system for waking us at 4 in the morning when the stars still showing. A system for lining us up for morning count. A system for dividing work crews and setting cotton quotas. A system for punishment that measured pain in precise increments. The whipping post stood in the center of the quarters like a wooden altar where blood was offered to the gods of commerce. Made from seasoned oak, worn smooth by rope and rough from the splintering of men's backs against it. On punishment days, Pike would gather us all around to witness. Said it was education. Said it was necessary for the maintenance of good order and discipline. Good God Almighty, the lessons that post taught. Taught us that speaking out of turn would cost you 10 lashes. Taught us that slow work would cost you 20. Taught us that looking a white person in the eye would cost you 30. Taught us that running away would cost you 50. And getting caught would cost you whatever Pike felt like giving, up to and including the final lesson. Harper walked by that post every morning on his way to the cotton fields, walked by it every evening on his way back to the quarters, never looked at it directly, never let his eyes linger on the dark stains that summer rain couldn't wash away. But I tell you now, that post was talking to him, whispering lessons about power and pain, about who gets to hurt and who has to take it. The cotton fields stretched further than hope could reach, rows and rows of plants that drank our sweat and gave back nothing but more work. Under that Virginia sun that burned like the furnace door of hell, bent backs moved in rhythm, as old as sorrow. Pick and drag, fill the sack until it weighed more than a grown man. Then drag it to the weigh station where Pike would check every pound. Cotton quota was 200 pounds a day for a full-grown man. Less than that, you didn't eat full. Much less than that, you met the whipping post after dark. More than that, you might earn yourself a cup of molasses or a piece of salt pork with your cornmeal. But Harper, he never picked for rewards, picked just enough to stay alive and keep the whip away. Saved his strength for something else. At night, when the day's count was done and Pike finally walked back to his cabin, the quarters would fill with the sound of exhausted people finding rest, children crying for mothers sold away, women humming spirituals to keep the fear at bay, men sitting quiet by small fires, staring into flames that reminded them of the freedom they'd lost or the vengeance they dreamed about. Harper would sit apart from the others, not unfriendly but not social neither, watching the fire burn down to coals, listening to the night sounds of Virginia countryside, where owls called like lost souls, and the wind through the trees sounded like voices speaking in tongues nobody living could understand. The conjure woman, old Sarah, used to say that fire was the memory of the sun, said that every flame carried a piece of that first light, the light that God used to push back the darkness at the beginning of the world, said that anybody who knew how to listen could hear the voices of ancestors in the crackling wood, could see the faces of African kings and queens in the dancing flames. Harper was learning to listen, learning to see, learning that some kinds of fire burn everything they touch, and other kinds of fire only burn what needs burning, learning that the difference was in the hands that held the flame. And every night, Pike's boots would echo across the plantation grounds as he made his rounds, checking locks and counting heads, making sure his human property was secure for another night. Never knowing that in the quarters, by the dying fires, something was growing that no lock could hold and no count could measure, something that was getting ready to burn. Harper had them eyes, child. Eyes that seen everything and forgot nothing. While other folks kept their heads down and their gazes fixed on cotton rows or tobacco leaves, Harper's eyes moved like a hawk circling over prey. Not bold enough to draw attention, not foolish enough to stare down white folks, but always watching, always learning, always gathering knowledge like a man collecting kindling for a fire he ain't ready to light yet. In them days of heavy chains and heavier hearts, watching was surviving. A man who could read the signs lived longer than one who couldn't. Harper learned to tell Pike's mood by the way his spurs jingled when he walked. Fast jingle meant trouble coming. Slow jingle meant the overseer was thinking, planning something that would cost somebody blood. No jingle at all meant Pike was trying to catch someone doing wrong, moving quiet like a snake through grass. Sweet Jesus, the boy could read weather in white folks' faces better than most could read clouds in the sky. Master Hartwell's wife, Miss Catherine, when she came out on the porch with her fan fluttering nervous-like, that meant visitors was coming, and the plantation had to look proper. Extra work for cleaning, extra care in the gardens, extra worry that some small thing would go wrong and bring down punishment on the quarters. But Harper's watching went deeper than just survival tricks, went down to the bone of understanding how power moved across that plantation like water finding the lowest ground. He seen how Pike reported to Hartwell every evening, standing hat in hand while the master sat in his chair like a king hearing court. Seen how Hartwell's word could send men to the auction block or save them from it. Seen how money flowed from cotton bales to bank accounts while black bodies counted as nothing but tools for harvest. Old folks say the eyes are the window to the soul, but Harper's eyes was more like shutters, kept most of what he was thinking locked up tight inside, showed just enough to get by without drawing attention. When Pike walked the rows counting cotton sacks, Harper's face stayed blank as fresh paper. When Hartwell preached about Christian duty and the natural order of things, Harper nodded along like he believed every word. When other slaves got whipped at the post, Harper watched without expression, learning lessons that wasn't being taught on purpose. The plantation was a book written in blood and sweat, and Harper was reading every page. He learned which drivers would look the other way if you needed extra water during the midday break. He learned which house slaves carried information back and forth between the quarters and the big house. He learned which white folks was genuinely cruel and which ones was just playing their part in a system bigger than any one person. Most important, he learned patience. Learned that a man who strikes too early strikes only once, but a man who waits for the right moment can change everything with a single blow. That patience burned in him like banked coals, glowing steady underneath while the surface stayed cool and controlled. In the quarters after dark, when the work bells finally fell silent and exhausted bodies found what rest they could on straw mattresses and thin blankets, Harper would sit by the dying fire and listen to the old stories. Stories about Nat Turner, who seen visions in the sky and led an uprising that shook Virginia to its roots. Stories about Denmark Vesey, who planned to burn Charleston to the ground and lead thousands to freedom. Stories about Gabriel Prosser, who almost freed Richmond before betrayal brought him down. The elders spoke these names in whispers, like prayers or curses depending on who was listening. They told how these men started just like Harper, just like all of them, picking cotton and tobacco while something grew inside them like a tumor of rage. Told how they watched and learned and waited until the moment was right, then struck like lightning splitting a tree. Rebellion ain't just about fighting, old Uncle Moses used to say, his voice like wind through dry leaves. Rebellion is about understanding, about seeing the system clear enough to know where it's weakest, about having the patience to wait and the courage to act when the time comes. Harper absorbed these lessons like dry earth soaking up rain. Every story added another layer to his understanding, another piece of knowledge that would serve him when his moment arrived. He learned that successful resistance required more than anger, more than strength, more than courage, required the kind of cold intelligence that could plan 3 moves ahead, that could see consequences before they happened. During the day, he picked cotton with mechanical precision, his hands working while his mind calculated. How many guards walked the perimeter at night? Which dogs was trained to track runaways and which was just for show? How long it took Pike to ride from the quarters to the big house when trouble started. How many shots the overseer carried in his pistol, and how fast he could reload. The other slaves saw Harper as reliable but distant. Good man to have on your work crew because he pulled his weight without complaint. Bad man to confide your troubles to, because he kept his own counsel and expected others to do the same. They didn't know that behind them quiet eyes, a revolution was taking shape. One that wouldn't be fought with armies or planned in secret meetings, but carried out by a single man who understood that sometimes justice comes down to one moment of perfect violence. And that moment was getting closer with every passing day, every casual cruelty, every reminder that black life was worth nothing in the mathematics of cotton and commerce. Harper felt it building inside him like pressure in a steam engine, contained but growing stronger, waiting for the moment when the vessel would finally burst and release all that accumulated force in one devastating explosion. The watching continued, the learning continued, the patience continued, but not for much longer. Now listen here, child, because this is where the story takes its turn toward fire and blood. This is where we learn that evil don't need a reason bigger than its own appetite, and justice sometimes gets born in the most ordinary moments. The morning started like any other morning in them quarters. 4 o'clock bell ringing across the plantation like a funeral toll, calling black bodies from sleep that never lasted long enough. Harper rose from his straw mattress, same as always, pulled on the same torn shirt and patched pants, stepped out into the Virginia darkness where stars still showed, and dawn was just a promise on the eastern horizon. The work bell called them to the cotton fields where yesterday's picking waited to be finished, and today's quota stretched out like a mathematical problem written in green rows under the climbing sun. Harper took his burlap sack and his cotton hook, fell into line with the other field hands, started the long walk toward another day of bent backs and bleeding fingers. But this morning carried something different in the air, something that made the dogs restless and the crows quiet in the trees. The old conjure woman, Sarah, had warned about days like this, days when the spirits walked close to the living world, and trouble followed behind them like smoke following fire. Pike was already waiting in the cotton field, sitting his horse like a pale monument to cruelty, had his whip coiled on his saddle horn and his pistol prominent on his hip, making sure every slave could see the tools of his authority. The overseer's pale eyes moved across the gathering workers like a snake's tongue tasting the air for weakness. "Y'all listen good," Pike called out, his voice carrying the morning chill. "Had some cotton come up short yesterday. Somebody ain't pulling their weight, and I aim to find out who." The slaves stood silent, eyes down, each one hoping the trouble would pass over them like the angel of death over marked doorposts. But Harper felt something cold settle in his stomach, a knowledge that came without reason. This wasn't about cotton shortages. This was about Pike needing to remind everyone who held the power of life and death over black bodies. As the day progressed and the sun climbed toward its merciless peak, Harper worked with the same steady rhythm he'd maintained for years. Pickin' stuff, the white cotton disappearing into his sack, while sweat ran down his back like rivers cutting channels in dark earth. His quota was on track. His row was clean. His conduct was beyond reproach. But when the midday count came and Pike rode down the rows checking each worker's progress, the overseer's horse stopped directly beside Harper's position. The pale eyes looked down with the kind of attention that meant trouble, the kind of focus that preceded pain. "Boy," Pike said, his voice flat as week old cornbread, "your cotton looks different than the others." Harper looked up carefully, not meeting the overseer's eyes but showing attention and respect. "How so, sir?" Pike dismounted, walked over to Harper's sack, pulled out a handful of the white fiber, examined it like he was looking for something specific, though Harper knew the cotton was clean and properly picked. No stems, no leaves, no debris that would reduce its value at market. "Looks to me like you've been careless with your picking," Pike announced, his voice loud enough for the other workers to hear. "Looks like you've been including inferior bolls with the premium cotton. That brings down the value of the whole crop." The accusation was false, and everyone knew it. Harper's cotton was consistently among the cleanest on the plantation. his technique refined by years of practice. But truth wasn't the point. Truth never was when white folks decided black folks needed teaching. "I've been careful, sir," Harper replied quietly. "Picked the same as always." Pike's face hardened like clay in a kiln. The overseer didn't appreciate being contradicted, even politely. Didn't like the suggestion that his judgment might be wrong. In the world of the plantation, questioning white authority was rebellion, and rebellion required correction. "You calling me a liar, boy?" The question hung in the hot air like a trap waiting to snap shut. Answer yes and face punishment for insubordination. Answer no and accept guilt for something you didn't do, still face punishment. Harper understood the mathematics of the situation with perfect clarity. Pike had decided someone was going to suffer today, and Harper had been selected for reasons that had nothing to do with cotton quality. "No, sir," Harper said finally. "Just saying I done my best." But Pike was already reaching for his whip, already moving into the familiar ritual of establishing dominance through pain. The other slaves backed away instinctively, creating space for the violence that was about to unfold. Nobody spoke up. Nobody could. Speaking up would only add their names to the list of those needing correction. "Your best ain't good enough," Pike declared, uncoiling the long leather whip with practiced efficiency. "Time you learned what happens to slaves who get careless with the master's property." Harper felt something shift inside his chest, like a door opening that had been locked for years. This was it. This was the moment he'd been watching for, waiting for, preparing for, without knowing he was preparing. Not because he'd chosen it, but because it had chosen him. The false accusation didn't matter. The trumped-up charges didn't matter. What mattered was that Pike had finally given Harper what every man who plans rebellion needs: justification that even God would understand. "Strip off that shirt," Pike commanded. "Time for you to meet the post." Harper began unbuttoning his shirt with steady hands while his mind calculated distances, angles, opportunities. The whipping post stood 50 yards away in the center of the quarters. Pike would march him there at gunpoint, tie him up, and begin the lesson in front of whatever audience the overseer could gather. But Harper was planning his own lesson, one that Pike wouldn't survive to remember. Lord have mercy on what happened next, child. Mercy on the souls who had to witness it. Mercy on the ground that had to drink what was spilled. Mercy on the memory that refuses to let it go. The whipping post stood in the center of the quarters like an altar built for the worship of fear, made from a single piece of seasoned oak, 8 feet tall and thick as a man's torso, driven deep into Virginia clay that had been packed hard by the feet of those who came to watch punishment being delivered. The wood was smooth in some places where rope had worn grooves, rough in others where men's backs had scraped against it during the writhing that always came when flesh met hickory. Pike marched Harper toward that post with his pistol drawn, not because he expected trouble, but because drawn pistols was part of the show. Part of the education that the overseer believed was necessary for maintaining good order among the slave population. Behind them came the other field hands driven by Pike's barked commands, to witness what happened to those who got careless with the master's property. The quarters filled slowly with black faces, carrying the weight of too much knowledge. Women holding babies close to their chests, trying to shield innocent eyes from sights no child should see. Old men standing silent with their hands clasped behind their backs, remembering their own meetings with the post. Teenagers learning lessons about the cost of stepping out of line, about what happened when white authority decided you needed teaching. Harper walked steady and upright, his bare chest gleaming with sweat in the afternoon sun. Every step toward the post was measured, controlled, deliberate. Not the walk of a man going to his punishment, but the walk of a man going to his destiny. The other slaves saw dignity in his bearing and wondered if they would face their own trials with half as much courage. Pike stopped at the base of the post and gestured with his pistol. "Put your hands against the wood, boy, high up as you can reach." Harper complied without resistance, placing his palms flat against the oak while Pike secured his wrists with rope that had bound countless other men to the same rough wood. The rope was old but strong, stained dark with sweat and blood and tears of those who had stood in the same position, facing the same inevitability. "Y'all pay attention now," Pike called out to the gathered slaves, his voice carrying the authority of a man who believed absolutely in his own righteousness. This here is what happens when you get careless with property that don't belong to you. This here is what happens when you forget your place and start thinking you can question white folks' judgment. The overseer walked to a small fire that burned constantly near the quarters, used for cooking and heating water, and the 100 small tasks that kept life functioning in the slave community. But today, the fire served a different purpose. Today it held the special implement that Pike reserved for the most important lessons. The club was 3 feet of seasoned hickory, thick as a man's wrist, with one end wrapped in leather for grip and the other end that had been hardened in flame until it was almost as hard as iron. Pike had been heating it in the coals since morning, preparing for a lesson that would burn as well as bruise, that would leave scars to remind the victim of proper behavior long after the immediate pain faded. When Pike pulled the club from the fire, it glowed red at the tip like a piece of the sun torn loose and held in human hands. Smoke rose from the heated wood, and the smell of burning oak filled the air with the promise of what was coming. The gathered slaves shifted uneasily, knowing this punishment would be worse than the usual whipping, knowing they were about to witness something that would live in their nightmares. "Carelessness is like a disease," Pike announced, holding the glowing club where everyone could see it. "It spreads from one slave to another if you don't burn it out at the source. Time to perform some surgery on this boy's character." Harper's muscles tensed against the rope binding his wrists to the post. Every nerve in his body screamed warnings about the fire approaching his back, but his mind stayed cold and clear, calculating the rhythm of what was coming. Pike would start slow, building the lesson gradually, making it last long enough to terrify the audience into perfect obedience. The first blow landed across Harper's shoulder blades with a sound like bacon hitting a hot skillet. The burned wood seared through skin and into muscle, opening a line of fire from shoulder to shoulder. Harper's body jerked against the post, but no sound escaped his throat. He had learned long ago that screaming only encouraged overseers to work harder. Pike stepped back to admire his work, watching the red welt rise across Harper's dark skin like a brand marking cattle. "That's one," the overseer announced to his audience. "Let's see how many it takes to cure this boy's carelessness." The second blow crossed the first at an angle, creating an X of burned flesh that would scar permanently, even if Harper survived. The third blow landed lower, across the ribs where the skin was thinner and the bones closer to the surface. Each impact sent waves of agony through Harper's body, but also sent waves of something else, something cold and calculating and absolutely focused on the man holding the burning wood. Harper began counting. Not the blows themselves, which he felt in every fiber of his being, but something else. Pike's breathing, the overseer's rhythm, the pattern of movement that would repeat itself until either Harper was unconscious or Pike was tired of the work. By the 10th blow, Harper had Pike's timing memorized. By the 20th, he understood the overseer's preferred angles of attack. By the 30th, he knew exactly how many steps Pike took between each strike, exactly where the man positioned himself for maximum leverage. The audience watched in horrified silence as the punishment continued. 40 blows, 50, 60. Harper's back became a map of burnt flesh and flowing blood, but still he remained conscious. Still he counted. Still he planned. Pike was beginning to sweat from the exertion, beginning to breathe hard from the work of systematic torture. The overseer's movements became slightly less precise as fatigue set in. His timing became slightly more predictable, and in that predictability, Harper found his opportunity. The moment was coming. The moment when all that watching and waiting and planning would finally bear fruit. The moment when the whipping post would teach a different lesson than Pike intended. The moment when Harper would stop being victim and become something else entirely. Something that burned hotter than any club pulled from fire. Now I tell you, child, what happened next ain't easy to speak about, ain't easy to remember. But the ancestors whisper that some truths got to be told, no matter how much they burn the tongue that speaks them. Some memories got to be kept alive, even when they cut like broken glass in the throat. The first blow from that burning club landed across Harper's shoulders with the sound of lightning striking dry wood. The heated hickory bit through black skin like it was paper, opening flesh that had never known such fire. Steam rose from the wound where superheated wood met living flesh, and the smell that filled the quarters was something between roasting meat and burning hair. Harper's body slammed against the whipping post, his chest crushed against the oak while fire spread across his back like spilled lamp oil catching flame. Every muscle in his frame contracted at once. Every nerve screamed warnings that his mind forced itself to ignore. But no sound passed his lips. Not a moan, not a cry, not even the sharp intake of breath that torture usually dragged from its victims. Pike stepped back to admire his handiwork, the glowing club still smoking in his grip. Where the wood had touched Harper's skin, a perfect line of charred flesh stretched from one shoulder blade to the other. The wound was deeper than a normal whip cut, burned clean through the first layers of skin and into the muscle beneath. Blood ran slow and thick, already beginning to clot in the heat. "That's education," Pike announced to the watching slaves, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a craftsman pleased with his work. "That's what happens when you get careless with the master's cotton. Y'all seeing this? Y'all learning from this boy's mistake?" The gathered slaves stood silent as tombstones, their faces carved from stone by years of witnessing such scenes. Children pressed closer to their mothers' skirts, trying to hide from images that would haunt their dreams for years to come. Old folks stared at the ground, knowing that watching too closely could put them in Harper's position. But Harper was learning too. Learning that pain had mathematics, had rhythm, had patterns that could be studied and understood. The fire in his back was teaching him about Pike's technique, about the overseer's preferred timing, about the small weaknesses that even practiced torturers carried. Pike returned to the fire and reheated the club, making sure the tip glowed bright orange before returning to his work. The second blow landed diagonal to the first, creating an X of burned flesh across Harper's upper back. This time the impact was different, the angle calculated to catch nerve clusters and maximize agony. Harper's vision went white for a moment as pain exploded through every fiber of his being. His hands clenched against the rope binding his wrists to the post, and blood began to flow from where his fingernails cut into his palms. But still no sound. Still that terrible, disciplined silence that spoke of a will stronger than oak and harder than iron. The third blow caught him across the ribs, where the skin was thinner and the bones closer to the surface. The burning wood cracked against Harper's frame, with a sound like branches snapping in a forest fire. This blow opened a wound that would never close properly, that would leave a scar wide as a man's thumb for the rest of Harper's life, however long that life might last. Pike was warming to his work now, finding his rhythm like a blacksmith at his forge. The overseer moved with practiced efficiency, reheating the club between blows, selecting his targets with the cold calculation of a surgeon. Lower back, shoulder blades, ribs, the tender flesh just above the kidneys where pain lingered longest. 10 blows. 20. 30. Harper's back became a landscape of fire and blood, a map of brutality drawn in charred flesh and flowing red. The smell of burning skin filled the quarters like incense offered to cruel gods. Steam rose from the wounds where heated wood had seared through to muscle and bone. The watching slaves began to sway slightly, some of them humming low spirituals under their breath. Not loud enough for Pike to hear and punish, but loud enough for Harper to catch the rhythm. Old songs from Africa carried across the middle passage in the hearts of stolen people. Songs that spoke of endurance, of survival, of spirits that could not be broken no matter what fire was brought against them. Harper heard those songs and felt something shift inside his chest. Not surrender to the pain, but acceptance of it. Not breaking under the pressure, but hardening like steel in the forge. Each blow was teaching him something new about the nature of power, about the difference between those who wielded violence and those who could absorb it without losing themselves. 40 blows, 50. Pike was beginning to breathe harder from the exertion, sweat beading on his pale forehead despite the coolness of the afternoon. The overseer's movements became slightly less precise as fatigue crept into his muscles. His timing became slightly more predictable as routine took over from calculation. And Harper felt that predictability like a gift from the ancestors. felt it like a door opening in the darkness, showing him the path he would soon take from victim to something else entirely. 60 blows, 70. The quarters had gone completely silent except for the sound of burning wood meeting flesh, and the low humming of the spirituals that wrapped around Harper like armor made of sound and memory. Pike paused to wipe sweat from his face, looking at his handiwork with the critical eye of an artist reviewing his canvas. Harper's back was a ruin of fire and blood, a testament to what happened when slaves forgot their place in the natural order of things. But the overseer wasn't finished yet, wasn't even close to finished. "We're just getting started, boy," Pike called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Got a lot more education to deliver before this lesson is complete." Harper hung against the post like a man crucified, his wrists raw from the rope, his back a gallery of burns and cuts that would mark him for life. But his mind stayed clear and cold, calculating the rhythm of what was coming next. Soon, he promised himself. Soon. Sweet Jesus, what came next was worse than anything hell could devise. Worse than the middle passage, worse than the auction block, worse than all the accumulated cruelties that black folks had endured since the first slave ship crossed the Atlantic carrying stolen souls in its belly. Pike had worked himself into a rhythm now, like a man chopping wood or splitting rails. Heat the club in the fire until it glowed like a piece of the sun. Approach the post with measured steps. Deliver the blow with practiced precision. Step back to observe the damage. The overseer had found his pace and settled into it like a comfortable old coat. 80 blows, 90. Harper's back was no longer recognizable as human flesh. It had become something else entirely. A landscape of charred meat and flowing blood that steamed in the cool air. Where the burning club had touched deepest, white bone showed through the ruins of muscle and skin. The smell was overwhelming now, sweet and nauseating, the smell of a man being cooked alive. The watching slaves had begun to weep silently, tears flowing down dark faces like rain on drought-stricken earth. Even the hardest among them, men who had survived their own meetings with the post, found their eyes wet with salt water. What they were witnessing went beyond normal punishment, beyond the routine cruelties of plantation life. This was something approaching evil in its purest form. But Harper endured. More than endured, he absorbed each blow like dry ground soaking up precious rain. Each impact of burning wood against ruined flesh taught him something new about the nature of suffering, about the distance between pain and surrender, about the difference between a body being destroyed and a spirit being forged. 100 blows. Pike paused in his work, breathing hard from the exertion. The overseer's shirt was soaked with sweat despite the afternoon coolness, and his pale face had taken on a red flush from standing so close to the fire. He looked at Harper's destroyed back with something approaching artistic satisfaction, the way a sculptor might view a difficult piece of marble after hours of careful chiseling. "Still conscious, are you?" Pike asked, his voice carrying genuine surprise. "Most boys would be screaming for their mamas by now. Most boys would be begging for mercy they ain't gonna get." Harper's response was silence. Not the silence of unconsciousness or shock, but the deliberate silence of a man who had chosen to keep his pain private. His breathing was shallow but steady, his pulse visible in the veins of his neck, his consciousness as clear as mountain spring water. Pike shook his head in something that might have been admiration, if it hadn't been coming from a man in the process of torturing another human being to death. "Got to give you credit, boy. You got more sand than most, but everybody breaks eventually. Just a matter of finding the right pressure to apply." The overseer returned to the fire and selected a fresh piece of wood, this one thinner than the club but longer. A switch cut from green hickory, flexible enough to wrap around a man's torso, sharp enough to cut through skin like a razor. Pike heated the tip until it glowed white-hot, until it looked like a brand fresh from the forge. "Let's try a different approach," Pike announced to his audience. "Sometimes you gotta be creative with your teaching methods." The heated switch landed across Harper's ribs with a different kind of agony, wrapping around his torso like a burning snake. The superheated wood seared through skin and muscle, following the curve of his body as it curled around to his front. The tip of the switch touched his chest just below the heart, leaving a mark that looked like a signature written in fire. This time Harper did make a sound. Not a scream, not a cry for mercy, but something deeper. A low moan that seemed to come from the very center of his being. A sound that carried the accumulated weight of every injustice, every humiliation, every moment of powerlessness that he had been forced to swallow. But in that sound, the watching slaves heard something else. Not surrender, but recognition. Not defeat, but awakening. Like a man waking from a long dream to discover that the nightmare was real, but that he was stronger than he had ever imagined. 120 blows. 150. Pike varied his technique now, using the switch to wrap around Harper's torso, using the club to pound against his spine, using smaller pieces of burning wood to trace delicate patterns of agony across flesh that had already been destroyed and destroyed again. The rope holding Harper's wrists to the post was slick with blood from where the bonds had cut through skin worn raw by struggling. His legs trembled with the effort of supporting his weight, muscles that had been strong as oak now shaking like leaves in a storm wind. But still he remained conscious, still he endured, still he refused to grant Pike the satisfaction of breaking. 200 blows. The number fell across the quarters like a death sentence. 200 times the burning wood had kissed Harper's flesh. 200 times fire had been introduced to living tissue. 200 lessons in what happened when slaves forgot their place in the natural order of plantation life. And still Harper hung against the post, breathing shallow but breathing, conscious and calculating and preparing for something that Pike couldn't see coming, because the overseer had never imagined that a man could absorb such punishment and still retain the capacity for thought, for planning, for revenge. The gathered slaves had begun to hum louder now, the old spirituals rising like smoke from their lips. Wade in the water, mixed with swing low, sweet chariot, African rhythms threading through Christian melodies to create something that was both prayer and battle song. Harper heard those voices and felt them wrap around him like invisible hands offering support, felt the strength of his ancestors flowing through the music, the power of all those who had suffered and endured, and ultimately triumphed over systems designed to crush the human spirit. Pike heard the humming too and turned to face the watching crowd, his face twisted with irritation. "Y'all shut that noise," he commanded. "This here is education, not entertainment. Y'all supposed to be learning, not singing." But the humming continued, quieter now but still present, still weaving its protective magic around the man tied to the post. And in that defiance, that small rebellion of voices raised in solidarity, Pike saw something that made his pale eyes narrow with fresh anger. "Looks like this lesson needs to go deeper," the overseer announced, returning to the fire with renewed purpose. "Looks like y'all need to understand what happens when you support rebellion instead of learning from proper correction." 300 blows, 400. Numbers that stopped meaning anything except as markers on the road toward something that none of them could see coming, but all of them could feel approaching like thunder in the distance. The moment when everything would change. Lord of glory. What happened next still haunts the wind that blows through Virginia cotton fields. Still echoes in the cry of nightbirds calling across plantation ground. Still lives in the memory of earth that drank more blood than rain that terrible day. 500 blows had fallen like hammer strikes on the anvil of Harper's back. 500 times the burning wood had kissed flesh that no longer looked human, that had been transformed into something between cooked meat and charcoal sculpture. The smell rising from his wounds was thick enough to taste, sweet and nauseating. The smell of a man being slowly roasted alive. Pike had stripped to his shirt sleeves now, his pale arms gleaming with sweat from the long labor of systematic torture. The overseer's breathing came hard and fast, like a man who had been chopping wood for hours under the blazing sun. But his eyes still burned with the cold fire of righteousness, still held the absolute conviction that what he was doing served a higher purpose than mere cruelty. 500 lessons in proper behavior, Pike announced to the watching slaves, his voice hoarse from the exertion but still carrying the authority of absolute power. 500 reminders about what happens when you get careless with the master's property. "Y'all counting? Y'all learning from this boy's mistake?" The gathered slaves stood like statues carved from sorrow, their faces masks of controlled anguish that revealed nothing of the storm raging beneath the surface. Children pressed against their mothers' legs, trying to hide from sights that would mark their dreams for years to come. Old folks stared at ground soaked red with the evidence of what white authority could do to black bodies when it felt the need for education. But Harper still hung conscious against the post, his wrists raw to the bone from the rope, his legs trembling with the effort of supporting weight that felt like mountains pressing down on his frame. Every nerve in his body screamed warnings about damage that could not be repaired, about fires that had burned through flesh and into places where healing was impossible. Yet his mind stayed clear as spring water, cold as winter morning, focused as a hawk circling over prey. Each blow had taught him something about Pike's rhythm, about the Overseer's patterns of movement, about the small weaknesses that even the most practiced torturer carried. Harper was no longer just enduring the punishment. He was studying it, learning from it, preparing to turn the lesson inside out. Pike selected a fresh piece of wood from the fire, this one a thick branch of seasoned oak that had been heating for hours until it glowed like a piece of molten metal. The Overseer tested its weight in his hands, feeling the balance, preparing for the final phase of Harper's education. "We're coming to the end now, boy," Pike said, his voice carrying something that might have been respect if it hadn't been wrapped in such casual cruelty. "Coming to the number that's going to break whatever's left of your stubborn spirit. 600 lessons ought to be enough to cure any slave of carelessness, don't you think?" 600. The number fell across the quarters like a curse spoken in a foreign tongue. 600 times the burning wood would kiss Harper's flesh. 600 opportunities for Pike to demonstrate the mathematics of power, the arithmetic of absolute authority over black bodies. But Harper was doing his own calculations now. 600 blows meant Pike would have to return to the fire at least 50 more times to reheat his instruments of torture. 50 opportunities for the Overseer to turn his back, to lower his guard, to present the kind of opening that a man with nothing left to lose might use to change the course of history. The 501st blow landed across what remained of Harper's shoulder blades, opening fresh wounds in flesh that had already been destroyed, and destroyed again. The impact drove him harder against the post, his chest crushed against oak worn smooth by the bodies of other men who had stood in the same position, facing the same inevitability. 510. 520. Pike was working faster now, eager to reach the symbolic number that would mark the completion of Harper's education. The Overseer's movements had become mechanical, repetitive, as automatic as a mill wheel grinding grain into flour. And in that automation, Harper found what he had been waiting for. Found the moment when Pike's attention wandered, when the Overseer's focus shifted from the man tied to the post to the work itself. Found the instant when predator became prey without knowing the transformation had occurred. 550 blows. 575. The numbers climbed like steps leading to a gallows, each one bringing Pike closer to the completion of his grim arithmetic. The Overseer's pale face was flushed red from the heat and exertion, sweat running down his cheeks like tears he would never shed for the man he was destroying. The gathered slaves had begun to sway now, their bodies moving in rhythm with the spirituals they hummed so quietly that only Harper could hear them clearly. Old songs of endurance and survival, melodies carried across the middle passage in the hearts of stolen people, rhythms that spoke of spirits too strong to be broken by any earthly power. Harper felt those songs enter his bloodstream like medicine, felt the strength of his ancestors flowing through the music and into his ravaged frame. Each note was a reminder that he was not alone, that he carried the hopes and prayers of all those who had suffered before him, all those who would suffer after him if the cycle was not broken. 590. 595. Pike paused in his work, breathing hard, savoring the approach of the climactic number. The Overseer looked at Harper's destroyed back with the satisfaction of an artist putting finishing touches on a masterpiece of agony. 5 more, boy, Pike announced. 5 more lessons, and then we'll see if you learned anything about being careless with cotton. But Harper had learned something else entirely. Had learned that there comes a moment in every man's life when he has to choose between dying on his knees or living long enough to make his enemies pay for what they've done. had learned that sometimes justice requires a man to become something harder than iron, something more dangerous than fire. The 596th blow landed across his spine with the sound of breaking wood. The 597th opened a wound that would never heal. The 598th drew blood that would stain Virginia soil for generations to come. 599. One more blow and Pike's arithmetic would be complete. One more lesson, and Harper's education in the mathematics of plantation discipline would be finished. One more impact of burning wood against ruined flesh, and the overseer could return to the big house to report another successful demonstration of white authority over black rebellion. But Harper was no longer thinking about the final blow. Was thinking instead about what would happen after Pike untied the rope and expected to find a broken man grateful for the mercy of being allowed to live. The overseer was about to learn that some kinds of education work both ways, that some lessons change the teacher more than the student. That fire, once lit, burns everything it touches. The 600th blow fell like the final note of a funeral song, landing across what remained of Harper's back with the sound of wet wood hitting stone. Pike stepped back from his work, breathing hard from the long labor, sweat running down his pale face like rainwater off a tin roof. The overseer looked at his handiwork with the satisfaction of a carpenter who had built something solid and lasting. Harper's body hung against the post like a scarecrow after a storm, held upright only by the rope binding his wrists to the oak. Blood ran slow and thick down his back, pooling in the red clay at his feet until the earth looked like it had been painted with something darker than iron ore. Steam still rose from the deepest wounds where the burning wood had kissed flesh and found bone beneath. "That's education," Pike announced to the watching slaves, his voice hoarse but carrying the authority of absolute power. "That's what 600 lessons in proper behavior looks like. You all seeing this? Y'all understanding what happens when you get careless with the master's property?" The gathered slaves stood silent as tombstones, their faces carved from stone by years of witnessing such scenes. Children had stopped crying long ago, their tears dried up by the heat of horror that no young mind should have to absorb. Old folks stared at the ground, their rheumy eyes fixed on red clay that had drunk too much blood over too many years. Pike untied the rope with practiced efficiency, his pale hands working the knots loose while Harper's ruined body sagged toward the earth. When the bonds finally gave way, Harper collapsed like a tree struck by lightning, his frame hitting the ground with the sound of something already broken trying to break again. "Drag him over by the fire," Pike commanded two of the field hands, gesturing toward the flames where his instruments of torture still glowed like small pieces of hell. "Let him think about his carelessness while the rest of y'all get back to work." The field hands approached Harper's body with the careful reverence usually reserved for handling the dead. They lifted him as gently as possible, feeling the heat still radiating from his wounds, smelling the sweet stench of cooked flesh that clung to him like a burial shroud. Harper's head lolled back as they carried him. His eyes rolled up until only the whites showed, his breathing so shallow it barely moved his chest. They laid him beside the fire pit where Pike's clubs and switches still smoldered among the coals, their work finished but their heat lingering like the memory of violence. Harper's body settled into the red clay like a piece of meat thrown to dogs, motionless except for the barely perceptible rise and fall of breathing that proved life still flickered somewhere inside the ruins of his frame. Pike holstered his pistol and gathered his tools, kicking dirt over the burning implements to bank the fire for later use. The overseer's work was done for the day, his lesson delivered with the kind of thoroughness that would be remembered in the quarters for years to come. As he walked away toward the big house, his boots rang against the hard clay with the rhythm of absolute authority. "Y'all get back to them cotton fields," Pike called over his shoulder. "Day ain't over just because this boy learned himself some manners. Master's quota don't pick itself." The slaves dispersed slowly, reluctantly, their eyes lingering on Harper's still form beside the dying fire. They moved like people leaving a funeral, carrying the weight of witness, the burden of having seen something that would mark their dreams forever. Children walked closer to their mothers. Old folks shook their heads and muttered prayers under their breath. Young men clenched their fists and tried to swallow rage that tasted like bile. but none of them saw what Harper saw in the darkness behind his closed eyelids. None of them felt what Harper felt as consciousness flickered like a candle flame in wind, threatening to go out, but somehow managing to stay lit. None of them understood that what they had witnessed was not an ending, but a beginning. Not a breaking, but a forging. As the quarters emptied and silence fell over the punishment ground, Harper lay beside the fire pit like a sacrifice offered to cruel gods. His back was a landscape of charred flesh and flowing blood, a testament to what white authority could do to black bodies when it felt the need for education. Every nerve in his frame screamed warnings about damage that could not be healed, about fires that had burned through flesh and into places where life itself was threatened. But deeper than pain, stronger than agony, harder than the iron that had branded his flesh, something else was stirring. Something that had been watching and learning and waiting for exactly this moment. Something that understood the mathematics of power better than Pike ever would. Harper's fingers moved against the red clay, not with the random twitching of a dying man, but with the deliberate purpose of someone testing his strength. His breathing deepened slightly, becoming more regular, more controlled. Behind his closed eyelids, his eyes tracked movement like a hunter following prey. The fire pit beside him still held glowing coals, still radiated heat that warmed his ruined skin. Among the coals lay the remnants of Pike's instruments of torture, pieces of wood that had been heated to white-hot intensity and used to write lessons in pain across Harper's back. But those same pieces of wood were still there, still hot, still capable of carrying fire. As the sun began to set over the plantation, and the quarters settled into the uneasy quiet that came after violence, Harper's hand moved closer to the fire pit. Not random movement, not the unconscious gestures of a man lost in shock, but the careful, calculated motion of someone reaching for something specific, something that would teach Pike a lesson in return, something that would show the overseer what happened when you pushed a man past the point where he had anything left to lose. What happened when you destroyed everything except the will to make your destroyer pay for what he had done? Night was falling across Virginia, and with it came the darkness that would hide what needed to be hidden. The darkness where old accounts were settled and new legends were born. The darkness where Harper would stop being victim and become something that would haunt Pike's dreams for the rest of his very short life. The fire was waiting. The wood was ready. And Harper's hand was almost close enough to claim what justice demanded. Now listen here, child, because this is where the story turns from suffering to something else entirely. Where a man who had been broken down to his very bones discovered that bones can be rebuilt stronger than before, that flesh can heal harder than iron, that a spirit tested in fire comes out burning with purpose that no earthly power can extinguish. The quarters had fallen into the deep quiet that comes after violence, when even the insects seem to hold their breath and the night birds forget their songs. The other slaves had returned to their cabins, carrying the memory of what they had witnessed like a weight too heavy for human shoulders. Children lay awake staring at cabin ceilings, seeing Harper's destroyed back every time they closed their eyes. Women hummed spirituals in voices barely above whispers, trying to sing away images that no prayer could erase. But Harper was not sleeping, was not unconscious, was not even close to dead, though anyone who looked at his ruined frame would have sworn he was already halfway to the grave. Instead, he lay beside the fire pit with the patience of a hunter waiting for prey, his breathing shallow but controlled, his muscles gathering strength like a coiled spring preparing to release. The fire pit still held glowing coals, banked but not extinguished, radiating heat that warmed Harper's torn flesh while he planned what came next. Among the coals lay the remnants of Pike's instruments of torture, pieces of seasoned hickory and oak that had been heated to white-hot intensity and used to write lessons in pain across black skin. But those same pieces of wood were still there, still hot, still capable of teaching lessons of their own. Harper's hand moved slowly across the red clay, feeling for the right piece of wood among the coals, not the largest piece, which would be too unwieldy, not the smallest, which would lack the weight needed for serious work. Something in between, something that would fit his grip like it had been made for his hand, something that would carry fire long enough to finish what Pike had started. His fingers found what they were looking for, a piece of hickory about 2 feet long, thick as a man's wrist, seasoned hard as iron and heated until it glowed like a piece of the sun broken off and held in human hands. The wood was still burning at one end, still radiating the kind of heat that could sear through flesh and into bone, still carrying the fire that would serve Harper's purpose. The pain of gripping the heated wood was nothing compared to what Harper had already endured. 600 blows had taught him that pain had limits, that agony could be absorbed and transformed into something more useful than screaming. His fingers closed around the cooler end of the burning club, feeling the weight of it, testing its balance, understanding that this piece of wood was about to become something sacred, not a weapon of random violence, not a tool of mindless revenge, but an instrument of justice wielded by hands that knew exactly what justice required. Harper had watched Pike work for hours, studying the Overseer's technique, learning the rhythm of systematic torture. Now he would use that knowledge to teach his own lesson. But first, he had to reach Pike. Had to get from this spot beside the fire pit to wherever the Overseer was sleeping, confident in his power, secure in the knowledge that he had broken another slave into proper submission. Had to move his ruined body across plantation ground without being seen by the patrollers who rode the boundaries at night, looking for runaways and troublemakers. Harper tested his legs, feeling muscles that had been savaged by Pike's clubs but not completely destroyed. The pain was extraordinary, like standing upright inside a furnace, but pain was just information now. Information about what his body could and couldn't do, about how far he could push damaged flesh before it failed him completely. He could walk, slowly, carefully, like an old man navigating icy ground, but he could walk, could move from shadow to shadow, using the darkness that had hidden so many other acts of resistance over the long years of slavery. Could become invisible the way black folks had learned to become invisible, blending into the night like smoke into air. The burning club felt alive in his grip, pulsing with heat that seemed to match the rhythm of his heart. The wood had absorbed more than fire during its time in the coals. It had absorbed Harper's pain, his rage, his absolute determination to balance the scales of justice. Now it was ready to fulfill its purpose, to teach Pike what happened when a man pushed another man past the point of endurance. Harper struggled to his feet, swaying like a tree in high wind but remaining upright through sheer force of will. His back was a ruin of charred flesh and flowing blood, but his front was whole, his arms still functional, his hands still capable of gripping the instrument that would deliver his response to Pike's education. The walk to Pike's cabin would take him across open ground, where moonlight made concealment difficult, past the quarters where any sound might wake someone who could raise an alarm. But Harper had spent years learning the geography of the plantation, memorizing every path and hiding place, understanding the patrol patterns that kept slaves penned like livestock. He knew which cabin Pike slept in, knew that the Overseer lived alone in a one-room structure near the edge of the quarters where he could respond quickly to any disturbance, knew that Pike kept his pistol on a table beside his bed, but relied mostly on the fear he had spent years building to keep slaves from approaching his door. That fear was about to prove inadequate. Harper began his journey across the plantation ground, moving with the deliberate care of a man who understood that discovery meant immediate death, but who had already accepted that risk as part of the price of justice. Each step sent fire through his ruined back. Each movement reminded him of the 600 lessons Pike had delivered with such systematic thoroughness. But each step also brought him closer to the moment when those lessons would be repaid with interest. When Pike would learn what it felt like to face the burning wood, to feel fire eating through flesh, to understand that some kinds of education worked both ways. The club glowed in Harper's grip like a torch carried by an angel of vengeance, lighting his path toward the reckoning that had been building since the first blow fell. Behind him, the fire pit continued to smolder, its coals keeping their heat like a promise of more flames to come. Ahead lay Pike's cabin, and inside it slept a man who had no idea that his student was about to become his teacher. Pike's cabin sat apart from the slave quarters like a monument to white authority. its walls solid timber instead of the rough planks that housed black families, its roof tight against rain that leaked through a dozen cracks in slave housing. A single window faced east toward the cotton fields, where Pike could watch for trouble when dawn broke, and a heavy wooden door secured with an iron latch kept out unwanted visitors. But locks and latches meant nothing to a man who had already passed through fire and emerged on the other side carrying justice in his burned hands. Harper approached the cabin with the patience of a hunter stalking prey, moving from shadow to shadow while the burning club pulsed like a heartbeat in his grip. The overseer slept the sleep of the righteous, or at least the sleep of a man who believed absolutely in his own righteousness. Pike's breathing came deep and regular through the cabin's thin walls, the sound of someone at peace with the day's work, satisfied with lessons delivered and order maintained. His pistol lay on a rough table beside his narrow bed, loaded but not cocked, ready for emergencies but not expecting them. Harper tested the cabin door with fingers that still bled from rope burns, finding the latch unlocked because Pike had never imagined that any slave would dare approach his sleeping place. The iron mechanism moved without sound, well-oiled and maintained like everything else the overseer used to maintain control over black bodies and black souls. The door swung open on hinges that whispered rather than creaked, revealing the interior of Pike's domain. A single room with a bed, table, and chair, clothes hung on wooden pegs, a wash basin and pitcher for morning ablutions. Simple furnishings for a simple man whose pleasures came from the exercise of power over those who couldn't fight back. Pike lay on his back, one arm thrown across his eyes to block moonlight streaming through the window, his breathing deep and untroubled by dreams of the man he had tortured that afternoon. The overseer's pale face looked almost peaceful in sleep, like a child who had played hard and earned his rest through honest labor. Harper stood in the doorway for a long moment, studying the sleeping figure, feeling the weight of the burning club in his hands, while 600 different agonies sang through his ruined back. This was the moment he had been moving toward since the first blow fell, the culmination of every lesson Pike had delivered about power and submission, about who held authority and who was meant to accept it without question. But Harper's education had taught him different lessons, had taught him that power was not permanent, that authority was not absolute, that every system of oppression carried within itself the seeds of its own destruction, had taught him that justice delayed was not necessarily justice denied, that patience could be its own form of resistance. Pike stirred slightly in his sleep, perhaps sensing some change in the cabin's atmosphere, some shift in the quality of darkness that surrounded his bed. The overseer's breathing quickened almost imperceptibly, his body responding to warnings that his conscious mind hadn't yet processed. Harper stepped across the threshold, his bare feet silent against rough wooden floors that creaked under Pike's boots, but accepted Harper's weight without complaint. The burning club cast dancing shadows on the cabin walls, making the small space seem alive with movement, with spirits of all those who had suffered under Pike's systematic cruelties. 2 steps from the door to the foot of Pike's bed. 2 steps that carried Harper from victim to something else entirely, from the man who had hung bleeding against the whipping post to the instrument of justice that plantation mathematics had never accounted for. 2 steps that transformed 600 blows from lesson to prophecy. Pike's eyes opened suddenly, perhaps feeling the heat radiating from the burning club, perhaps sensing the presence of another person in his private space. The overseer's pale gaze fixed on Harper's silhouette, taking in the ruined figure standing at the foot of his bed, trying to process what his eyes were telling him. "What the hell?" Pike started to say, his voice thick with sleep and confusion. His right hand moved instinctively toward the pistol on the bedside table, reaching for the tool that had always been sufficient to maintain his authority over black bodies. But Harper moved faster than Pike's sleep-fogged reflexes could follow. The burning club swung in a perfect arc, not wild or desperate, but calculated and precise as Pike's own blows had been. The glowing wood connected with Pike's reaching arm just above the wrist, searing through skin and muscle with the sound of bacon hitting a hot skillet. Pike's scream split the night air like a saw cutting through green wood, high and desperate, and filled with the kind of agony that he had inflicted on others, but never experienced himself. The overseer's hand spasmed away from his pistol, fingers opening and closing around empty air, while the smell of burned flesh filled the cabin. "Now you learning," Harper said, his voice quiet but carrying absolute authority. "Now you getting educated about what that fire feels like when it touches your skin instead of mine." Pike tried to roll away from the burning club, tried to put distance between himself and the instrument of his own torture techniques. But Harper was already moving, already positioning himself to deliver the next lesson in a curriculum that Pike had designed himself, but never expected to experience from the receiving end. The second blow landed across Pike's chest, the burning wood pressing against white flesh that had never known such intimate acquaintance with fire. The overseer's nightshirt burst into flame where the club touched it, and Pike slapped frantically at the spreading fire while screams continued to pour from his throat. 600 times, Harper said, pressing the burning club harder against Pike's chest, letting the heat penetrate through skin and into muscle, letting the fire teach lessons that words could never convey. 600 times you put this fire against my back. Now you gonna learn what 600 times feels like from the other direction. Pike's eyes went wide with understanding, with the terrible recognition that the tables had turned completely, that the student had become teacher, and the lesson was going to be thorough. The overseer opened his mouth to beg, to plead, to offer bargains that Harper had no intention of accepting. But Harper wasn't interested in words, wasn't interested in explanations or apologies or promises of better behavior, was interested only in justice, in the kind of mathematical precision that Pike himself had demonstrated during 600 lessons in proper submission. The burning club pressed deeper into Pike's chest, finding the spaces between ribs, seeking the heart that had never shown mercy to others and would receive none in return. The education was about to reach its final lesson. Now I tell you, child, what happened in that cabin between Harper and Pike ain't something the history book's gonna record, ain't something the white folks gonna write down for their grandchildren to read, but it's something that lives in the very walls of that place, something that soaked into the wooden floors and stayed there like bloodstains that no amount of scrubbing can wash away. Pike lay on his narrow bed with the burning club pressed against his chest, feeling fire eat through his nightshirt and into the pale flesh that had never known such intimate acquaintance with pain. The overseer's screams had died down to whimpering now, not because the agony had lessened, but because his throat had gone raw from the kind of crying he had heard from others, but never expected to experience himself. Harper stood over him like a dark angel with wings made of smoke and flame, his ruined back catching moonlight that streamed through the cabin window. The wounds Pike had carved into Harper's flesh still wept blood, still sent rivers of red running down his frame to pool on the rough wooden floor. But Harper's face showed no pain now, only the cold calculation of a man delivering justice with the same systematic precision he had learned from watching 600 lessons in cruelty. "You remember this feeling, Pike," Harper said, his voice quiet but carrying the authority of absolute power. "You remember what it's like when that fire touches your skin, and there ain't nobody gonna help you, ain't nobody gonna stop it, ain't nobody gonna show mercy just because you start crying like a baby." Pike's pale eyes rolled wild in his head, looking for escape that didn't exist, looking for help that wouldn't come, looking for mercy from a man who had learned mercy's value by having it denied to him 600 times. The overseer's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water, trying to form words that his burned throat couldn't deliver. "Please," Pike finally managed to whisper, the word coming out cracked and desperate. "Please, I was just doing my job. Master told me to maintain discipline. I was just following orders." Harper's laugh was like winter wind through dead leaves, cold and sharp and empty of any warmth. "Following orders," he repeated, pressing the burning club harder against Pike's chest until the smell of cooking flesh filled the small cabin. 600 times you was following orders. Now I'm following something too. Following justice. Following the voice of every slave who ever hung bleeding on that post while you counted out their punishment. The fire club found the spaces between Pike's ribs, seeking the heart that had never shown compassion, never granted mercy, never recognized that black bodies held souls worth considering. Harper worked with the same methodical patience that Pike had demonstrated, building agony layer by layer, letting the lesson penetrate deep enough to be permanent. Pike's body arched against his narrow bed, muscles contracting in spasms that reminded Harper of his own writhing against the whipping post. But where Harper had maintained his silence, Pike filled the cabin with sounds of anguish that carried across the plantation ground like animal cries in the night. "The others can hear you," Harper observed, his voice conversational despite the horror unfolding in that small space. "All them slaves you whipped and branded and tortured, they laying in their cabins listening to you scream. You think they gonna come help you? You think they gonna feel sorry for the man who taught them that crying don't stop the pain?" Pike tried to roll away from the burning club, tried to escape the fire that had become his teacher, his educator, his introduction to a curriculum he had designed but never expected to experience. But Harper followed every movement, keeping the heated wood pressed against flesh that blistered and charred and filled the cabin with smoke that carried the sweet stench of roasting meat. "I got all night," Harper continued, his tone as casual as if he were discussing the weather or the cotton crop. "Got all the time in the world to make sure you understand every lesson you tried to teach me. 600 lessons, Pike. We ain't even started counting yet." The overseer's struggles grew weaker as pain overwhelmed his ability to think clearly, to plan escape, to do anything but endure what Harper had endured with so much more dignity. Pike's screams became moans, his moans became whimpers. His whimpers became the kind of broken breathing that marked a man whose spirit was cracking under pressure too great for human endurance. But Harper wasn't finished, wasn't even close to finished. The fire club still glowed with heat that could burn through bone, still carried the power to teach lessons that would last as long as Pike drew breath, which, Harper calculated with the cold precision of a man who had learned mathematics through suffering, wouldn't be very much longer. "You feel that fire eating into your heart?" Harper asked, leaning close enough that Pike could see the wounds covering his back, could smell the blood that still flowed from 600 separate agonies. "That's what justice feels like when it finally catches up with a man who thought he was above it. That's what happens when you push somebody past the place where they got anything left to lose." Pike's eyes fixed on Harper's face, seeing something there that made him understand with perfect clarity that begging wouldn't help, that promises wouldn't matter, that this was the kind of reckoning that came without possibility of appeal or reprieve. The overseer had spent years building his authority on the foundation of other men's pain, and now that foundation was burning down around him. Harper pressed the fire club deeper into Pike's chest, feeling resistance give way as heated wood found its target. The overseer's heart, that muscle that had pumped blood through a system dedicated to the destruction of human dignity. That organ that had never skipped a beat when black children cried for sold mothers or black men begged for mercy they would never receive. Now that heart was learning its final lesson, learning what it felt like to be consumed by the same fire it had used to consume others, learning that some kinds of education were permanent, that some lessons changed everything they touched, that some teachers never gave their students the chance to forget what they had learned. The fire found Pike's heart and made it stop. Sweet Jesus, the silence that fell over that cabin when Pike's heart stopped beating was different from any quiet that had ever touched plantation ground. It was the silence of justice finally served, of scales finally balanced, of a debt finally paid in the only currency that mattered. It was the silence of a system that depended on fear, discovering that fear worked both ways, that terror could flow uphill as well as down. Harper held the burning club against Pike's chest for a long moment after the overseer's breathing stopped, making sure the lesson was complete, making sure the fire had done its work thoroughly. Pike's pale eyes stared at the cabin ceiling, wide open but seeing nothing, reflecting moonlight but holding no consciousness behind them. The overseer's face was locked in an expression of absolute surprise, as if even in his final moment he couldn't quite believe that the mathematics of power had been inverted so completely. The smell of burned flesh filled the small cabin like incense offered to gods of justice, mixing with the smoke that rose from Pike's destroyed chest. The fire club still glowed in Harper's grip, still radiated heat that warmed his ruined back, still carried the power to teach more lessons if more teachers needed educating. But Pike's education was finished, completed with the same thoroughness that the overseer had brought to his own pedagogical methods, concluded with the same attention to detail that Pike had demonstrated when delivering 600 separate instructions in proper behavior. The student had become teacher. The victim had become justice. The broken man had become something harder and more dangerous than anything the plantation system had ever produced. Harper straightened slowly, feeling muscles protest the movement, feeling wounds reopen where the motion stretched skin that had been charred beyond healing. Every nerve in his body sang songs of agony that would continue for whatever time remained to him. But the pain felt different now. Not the helpless suffering of a man being destroyed by forces beyond his control, but the sacred pain of a warrior who had faced his enemy and emerged victorious. The burning club cooled gradually in Harper's grip, the wood losing its glow but retaining enough heat to remind him of what he had accomplished. This piece of hickory had been Pike's instrument of torture, heated in fire and used to carve lessons in submission across black skin. Now it had delivered its final lesson to the man who had wielded it, teaching Pike what it felt like to burn from the inside out. Harper looked around the cabin, taking inventory of Pike's possessions with the calm assessment of a man who understood that his time was limited. The overseer's pistol still lay on the bedside table, loaded but unfired, a symbol of authority that had proved useless when the moment of truth arrived. Pike's clothes hung on wooden pegs. His boots sat beside the door, his few personal items arranged with the neatness of a man who believed his life would continue indefinitely. But life, Harper had learned, was more fragile than white folks liked to admit. Life could end as quickly as a heart could stop beating, as suddenly as fire could consume flesh, as permanently as justice could be served by hands that had suffered long enough to earn the right to serve it. The cabin's single window faced east toward the cotton fields where Pike had supervised countless hours of forced labor, where black backs had bent under the Virginia sun, while white authority counted profits in bales and bushels. Soon that window would frame the dawn that Pike would never see, the sunrise that would reveal his body to whoever came looking for the overseer who had failed to appear for morning roll call. Harper walked to the window, moving carefully to avoid opening his wounds any wider than they already were. Through the glass, he could see the slave quarters where other victims of Pike's educational methods lay sleeping, their dreams troubled by memories of the whipping post, their bodies marked by scars that would never fully heal. They would wake to a different world in the morning, a world where Pike's authority had been permanently revoked, where the overseer's systematic cruelty had been answered with precision that matched its own thoroughness. Some would celebrate quietly, understanding that justice had finally visited the plantation. Others would worry about what would happen next, knowing that Pike's death would bring investigations, suspicions, punishments that might fall on any slave unlucky enough to attract attention. But Harper wouldn't be there to face those consequences, wouldn't be available for questioning or punishment, or the kind of systematic torture that masters reserved for slaves who committed the ultimate transgression of striking back at white authority. Harper's time on the plantation was finished, completed with Pike's final breath. The burning club had cooled enough to carry without causing fresh burns. Harper tucked the weapon inside his torn shirt, feeling the still warm wood against skin that Pike had destroyed with such methodical precision. The club would stay with him for whatever time remained, a reminder of justice served and lessons learned, a tool that might teach other overseers the mathematics of fear worked both ways. Harper moved toward the cabin door, stepping carefully around Pike's body, avoiding the blood that had pooled on the rough wooden floor. Behind him, the overseer lay still and silent, his pale face reflecting moonlight that would soon give way to dawn. Pike's education was complete, his final lesson learned, his authority permanently transferred to someone who understood power's true nature. The door opened on hinges that whispered like secrets being shared among the ancestors. Harper stepped into Virginia darkness that no longer held terror for a man who had walked through fire and emerged carrying flames of his own. The plantation spread around him like a map of suffering, but now it was also a testament to what happened when the oppressed finally found their strength. Somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird called across the cotton fields, its voice carrying notes that sounded almost like freedom. Harper listened to that song while the burning club pressed warm against his chest, while his ruined back reminded him of prices paid and lessons learned, while justice settled into his bones like medicine that healed from the inside out. The heart had stopped. The lesson was complete. The fire had taught its final instruction. And Harper walked into darkness that would soon give birth to legends whispered in quarters and feared in big houses. Stories of the man who carried burning wood and used it to balance scales that had been tilted too long in favor of cruelty. The walking continued. The fire burned on. The justice spread like flame through dry timber, consuming everything it touched. Listen now, children of the red dust, while I finish this tale that ain't really finished. This story that keeps living long after the last word is spoken. Because some stories don't end when the telling stops. Some stories grow stronger in the retelling, put down roots in the hearts of those who hear them, sprout leaves in the minds of those who understand what justice costs and what it's worth. Harper walked away from Pike's cabin carrying fire in his hands and justice in his heart, his ruined back streaming blood that marked his path across Virginia clay. The plantation slept around him, unaware that one of its foundation stones had just been pulled free, that the system built on fear and maintained by cruelty had suffered a crack that would spread until the whole structure came tumbling down. By morning, they would find Pike's body burned from the inside out, his chest opened by fire that had finally taught him what his own lessons felt like from the receiving end. Master Hartwell would rage and investigate, would question slaves and search quarters, would bring in patrollers with dogs to track whoever had committed such an unthinkable transgression against white authority. But they never found Harper, never even found his trail, because a man who has learned to survive fire can learn to disappear into smoke, can learn to become invisible the way heat shimmer becomes invisible against summer sky. Harper walked into Virginia darkness and became part of it, became one with the night that had hidden so many other acts of resistance over the long years of slavery. Some say he died of his wounds before the sun rose, that 600 blows finally claimed the life they had been trying to take. Others say he made it to the Underground Railroad, followed the North Star to freedom in Canada, where former slaves could live without fear of masters or overseers or the whipping post. Still others claim he stayed in Virginia, moving like a ghost through the plantation country, carrying his fire club from place to place, teaching other overseers the lessons Pike had learned too late. But I tell you what the old folks know, what the conjure women whispered, what the root doctors understood when they read signs in the smoke and ashes. Harper didn't die that night, didn't disappear into freedom or fade into legend. Harper became something else entirely, something that lives in the space between memory and hope, between justice and vengeance, between the fire that destroys and the fire that purifies. In the years that followed Pike's death, overseers throughout Virginia began to have dreams. Dreams of a tall figure moving through plantation darkness, carrying wood that glowed like pieces of the sun. Dreams of justice that came with mathematical precision, that counted every blow and remembered every cruelty, and calculated exactly what payment was owed for systematic torture. Some of those overseers changed their ways, became less quick with the whip, less eager to heat brands in fires meant for cooking. Others doubled down on cruelty, used Pike's death as justification for even harsher punishments, even more systematic destruction of black bodies and spirits. But all of them looked over their shoulders when they walked alone at night. All of them checked their cabin doors twice before sleeping. All of them wondered if they would wake to find a burning club pressed against their chests. The slaves knew that something had shifted in the balance of power, that the mathematics of plantation life had been altered by what happened in Pike's cabin. They sang different songs in the quarters, work songs that carried messages about fire and justice, and the price of pushing a man past the place where he had anything left to lose. Children learned new stories, tales about ancestors who refused to stay broken, who gathered fire instead of surrendering to it. Master Hartwell hired a new overseer, a man named Crawford who claimed he could maintain discipline without Pike's excessive methods. Crawford lasted 3 months before they found him beside his own cabin, burned from the inside out, his chest opened by fire that had taught him the same lesson Pike had learned. The next overseer made it 6 weeks. The one after that didn't last 2 days. Eventually, no white man would take the job of overseer on the Hartwell plantation. The position became cursed, haunted by something that no earthly authority could control or predict or defend against. The plantation began to fail. Cotton yields dropped. Slaves started running away with impunity because there was no overseer left to track them down. Within 5 years of Pike's death, Master Hartwell sold the plantation to pay his debts. The land was divided up, the slaves scattered to other farms, the big house left to rot under Virginia weather. But the fire remained. The memory lived. The lesson continued to burn in hearts that had learned what resistance looked like when it finally found its courage. And late at night, when the moon is dark and the wind moves through abandoned cotton fields, folks say you can still see him. A tall figure walking between the rows where slaves once bent their backs under the blazing sun, carrying wood that glows like justice made manifest. Some say it's just swamp gas or heat lightning. Others know better. Harper is still walking, still carrying that fire club, still teaching lessons to anyone foolish enough to believe that cruelty can be practiced without consequence, that power can be exercised without accountability, that human beings can be reduced to property without someone eventually presenting the bill for such reduction. The fire spreads from heart to heart, from story to story, from generation to generation. Every time someone refuses to bow down when the powerful demand submission, Harper's fire burns a little brighter. Every time someone stands up to authority that has forgotten its responsibility, that flame grows a little stronger. This is why I tell this story, child. Not to teach hatred, but to teach memory. Not to encourage violence, but to remind the world that justice delayed is not justice denied. That accounts must eventually be settled. That every system built on the suffering of others carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction. The whip may silence voices, but it cannot silence the fire that burns in hearts too strong to be broken. The chain may bind bodies, but it cannot bind the spirit that learns to transform pain into purpose, suffering into strength, victimhood into victory. Harper's story lives because it has to live, because memory is sacred, because justice is eternal, because some flames burn forever once they're properly lit. Those who suffered, suffered. Those who resisted, left their mark on history. And those stories, those memories, those flames of justice, they keep burning here, in the souls of slavery.